Pot in My Noggin, hosted by CK Sims, creating a platform to elevate, educate, and heal by creating a space where people can share their stories of struggle, triumph, and redemption. CKS Media.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Pot in My Noggin. I'm your host, CK Sims, and today we are joined by Mr. Seth Gale. Welcome. How are you?
I'm doing well. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for being here. So, as everyone who's listened to my podcast before, I'm all about stories of struggle and resilience and finding your way through to your own definition of success. And I feel that, Seth, you might be the epitome of that story. So let's get into it. Let's talk about, when I read your piece about when you were 2 and everything that happened after that, that's a lot. So let's get into it.
Yeah, so unfortunately, life kind of kicked off pretty quick for me. My mom had me and my 2 sisters by the time she was maybe 19 or 20. I think she had us all back-to-back years. So it was like 16, 17, 18 or 17, 18, 19, something like that. She had all 3 of us really quick. And when I was about maybe 1 or 2, she got into a fight with my father, and my father ends up stabbing her behind the ear and nearly kills her. This whole thing was like a he said, she said between the 2 of them. She says he attacked her, he says that she attacked him, and he defended himself. So don't really know what happened to this day, other than my father was arrested and taken away. So I didn't grow up with a father. I don't have any memories of having a father in my life as a young man. The earliest memory that I have of my father is meeting him in prison, and I'll get to that in a little bit. So, that's kind of the extent of my childhood. Was me and my sisters raising ourselves because we had a single mother of 3. And being that she was a single mother, she had to work a lot, so we were home all the time alone. And so we were cooking, raising ourselves, cooking, doing the laundry, doing all the normal things you got to do, feeding yourself, stuff like that. So, when I was, go ahead.
I'll pause you for a second. Okay, so you said this happened at 2, right?
Mm-hmm.
And your sisters are younger or older?
So I'm the middle child. So one of them's younger, one of them's older. Yep.
So how early did you start caring for yourself?
The earliest that I can remember, I was in kindergarten-ish. And I might have been first grade, but I think it was kindergarten, first grade. It was definitely by first grade, but probably started around kindergarten because my older sister would have been in first grade. And looking back on it, you're talking 4, 5, and 6, 5, 6, and 7, somewhere in there, the age range between the 3 of us. And as bad as that sounds, kids can be very capable at that age.
Oh, I totally agree with you. They can be. They shouldn't be, but
right.
They can be. No judgment. I don't want to judge. I just want to say, they shouldn't be at that age. But continue.
Yeah. So I just remember being in kindergarten, first grade, and coming home, and we were just taking care of ourselves. We cooked our food on the microwave. As soon as we could stand on the chairs and reach the sink, we were washing our dishes, doing the laundry. As soon as we could, my mom raised us to be very sufficient or self-sufficient, sustaining, and things like that, because she was gone so much. And at that real young age, I didn't realize that life was different or wrong or bad. This was normal stuff to me. As I got older, I realized things would get worse and things were a little bit different. But at that young age, we were moving all the time. We were at different babysitters' houses a lot of times. A lot of times my mom couldn't afford a babysitter, and that's when we would be home alone. And when we did go to babysitters, there was one in particular that they had a teenage son who would end up molesting me when I was about 5. And that happened a few times. It wasn't anything crazy, I say, on the scale of molestation and child abuse. But it was just a few moments, maybe 4 or 5 times total, where he kind of exposed himself to me. I remember being in his bed with him. He would expose himself, and then he would look at me. I'd look at him, and he'd touch me, and he'd make me touch him. And I think that was about the extent of it. I don't really remember too many details of that. I do remember reporting him because I remember my grandparents asking me about it and asking me like what happened or if something had happened. And, nothing happened out of reporting him. The kid was, and he was a teenage kid. I don't blame him for it. Um, Surely something happened to him to be having that mindset of taking advantage of a little boy. And knowing what I know now in hindsight, he was definitely in a bad place with the influences that were around him. And later in life, he would actually, I think he may be in prison now, I'm not sure, but I know he went to prison for some time for raping the girl next door to him, maybe like 10 years later or something like that. So, anyways, that happened when I was about 5, and moved on from that. Nothing really happened, and life seemed as normal as it could be for several years. My mom had always smoked, and she had always drank. She smoked cigarettes, smoked weed, and always drank liquor and beer with her friends. She always had friends over, and they would always hang out and drink, and so that was always a part of my life. Excuse me. So she had always smoked and drank, and that was always a part of my life. We always saw that. And when I was about 9 or 10, it was almost like a switch flipped for her, where she just became suddenly like more angry. I'm not really sure what happened, but she started to get more abusive. It went from we had always gotten whooped as young kids, but it went from being whoopings to like just beating the shit out of your kids with no remorse, no regard, and no emotional support for them. So my mom, one day she came in, and the first time I remember her punching my sister in the face, she came into my room and threw a few punches, like hammer fist style, kind of punched her, and my older sister's head snapped back, hits the wall a few times. I jump on the other side of my bed. I'm just like crying. I'm terrified. I was about 10 years old when this happened. And I'm looking up on the other side from the other side of my bed, and I'm crying, and my mom looks at me and she says, why are you crying? Stop being a bitch before I give you something to cry about. And that really hurt. The physical things are painful as well, but the emotional damage, the emotional response is really what kind of drives you away from your mother or your father. I think if you whoop your kids and you explain to them that you love them, there may be some saving grace there, but when you beat the shit out of them and then you yell at them like that, it just doesn't help. And so, a couple weeks later, I got my share of that. My mom was hitting me with a paddle, like a typical whooping. But the first time she hit me, it was a lot harder than usual, and I fell to my knees, and she kept swinging. And so she hit me across my back 4 or 5 times. I fall to the floor, I'm screaming and crying, and she tells me to get the fuck up and go to my room, stop crying. And so I crawl to my room, I lay there and cry, and she never checked on me. She never seemed to care. So I was just real torn up as a young man, and because of that, I went outside the house. I was always gone. I was always looking for friends. I was always hanging out with friends, and I had an older friend that I met who lived around the corner from me. And for the sake of this story, I'll say his name's Jacob. And Jacob is about 5 years older. I meet him. He knows that I have a jacked up life at home, so he starts to kind of take me under his wing. He's taking care of me, and he's a good kid. He's doing all the right things for me, letting me hang out, play video games. He's feeding me, stuff like that. And when I Jacob, a couple weeks after that, maybe a month or two, he has a friend that comes over, and his friend is this grown man. This grown man walks in the front door. He's in his 30s. He's 6'5", 380 pounds. He's a Hispanic, but he's got real white skin, and he has this like long, slick back black hair. He's got the big like Dahmer style wireframe glasses on, and he walks in and he introduces himself to me, and I'm standing there 10 years old. I'm this tiny little boy, and we talk about football and video games and pizza, and we make some commonalities. I like all 3 of those things, and he does too. So he says, well, why don't you come up to the house with me and Jacob, and we hang out and play video games all weekend. So I said, okay, cool. So I go home, ask my mom. My mom says, okay, boom. So I go to his house. I start hanging out with Jacob and this guy. His name's Mondo. We called him Mondo. We start hanging out every weekend, and during this time, as I start hanging out with Jacob and Mondo more, my mom becomes more abusive. She starts dating she gets a new boyfriend. We move to a new house. She gets addicted to crack and cocaine, becomes, more of an alcoholic than she had ever been. And well, I don't know if she was ever an alcoholic, but she was drank a lot and she used a lot of drugs. And there was a lot of drug addicts in our house every day. And she was just like irate, just angry all the time. And my bedroom in this house that I lived in, this last house I lived in with my mom, my bedroom had a 4 foot by 2 foot hole in the ceiling, so I could look up through my ceiling and see the attic above. I could see the roof structure. So when it was raining or snowing, any kind of cold wind, all that was coming straight into my room. And at 10 years old, I laid there on this thin little mattress with a thin little blanket, wet the bed every single night, and I was incredibly suicidal at that point. Like, I just wanted to die all the time. I thought about it every single day, just wanted to end my life. I was getting bullied at school. Mom was abusive and all the drugs, so I saw many drug addicts in my house every day, just passed out on the couch, shaking, like just high out of their minds. So it's kind of going through it, obviously. And during this time, about 3 months into knowing this guy Mondo and hanging out with him, I started going to his house by myself a lot more. And sometimes Jacob would come and sometimes I'd go by myself, but I was naive to what was happening to me because of what was going on at his house. And, I remember going to his house and there was 3 TVs, 3 video games, 2 computers, a table with a bunch of stuff on there to play card games and all that. We had pizza, pop, energy drinks, coffee. We could cuss, watch whatever movies we wanted to watch, play as much video games. There was no rules at his house. It was like a kid's paradise. So I loved it. And so I would go to his house as much as I could. And about 3 months after knowing him, he finally starts to make his move on me and he starts to molest me. And so Monday through Friday, I'm dealing with my mom, the abuse, the drugs, the violence. Friday night, Saturday night, I would be at Mondo's house and he was molesting me. So this went on for about 2.5 years, this cycle between my mom and Mondo. And it was just I was escaping one hell going to another, And as it went on, about 2.5 years into it, my mom ends up getting arrested. She stabbed her boyfriend over some drugs in the bathroom, set some stuff on fire in the front yard. The cops come and take her. And I watched all this happen at 12 years old. Like, I was out in the front yard on a hot summer day and just see all this going on in front of me and was just incredibly hysterical. Probably one of the more traumatic moments of my life, seeing my mom get taken away from me in that cop car and watching her and, just being a few inches away from her while it was all happening. And, I felt like I was dying that day. You have this like weird feeling that comes through your body when that happens. And about 6 months later, I was at my grandparents' house finally. So when my mom was arrested, and for about 6 more months, I was bouncing around to different houses, living with random people, just kind of going to different schools, taking care of myself and surviving. And I was doing this by myself. I wasn't with my sisters. They went a separate direction. I went a different route. So, but anyways, about 6 months later, my grandparents find us, and I go to my grandparents' house. My sisters are already there. So my grandparents found my sisters before they found me. And I get there and they ask to adopt me. I say yes. My sisters say no. They go back and live with my mom. And I stay with my grandparents because I have a warm house with people who have money and cars and clothes and like food on the table. Like, this is a big deal to me. I was happy. So I stayed with my grandparents. But unfortunately, go ahead.
Okay. I've been sort of keeping.
Yeah.
Were you and your sisters in foster care? Is that how that bouncing happened?
No, I really don't know how we avoided the like system of foster care, because so we all went to live with my dad initially. I was only with my dad for maybe 3 weeks, 3 or 4 weeks. I had to leave because I almost went to juvie. I got into a bunch of trouble, went to alternative school, was getting in all kinds of trouble at this new school. So I left, and I don't know where my sisters went after I left. I know they stayed for some time. Don't know how long, but I left and I went to like live with a cousin, and then I lived with some random people, and then I lived with some more random people. And when I was living with these other people, this other family, my mom had threatened to come and pick me up, and I said no, I don't want to live with you. And so that's when my grandparents found me. But that all went on for like 4 or 5 months, something like that. But I was never in the foster care system, thankfully.
So like my mind is sort of trying to reel and process, right?
Yeah.
So, and I'm an adult who like I can't even conceptualize
Yeah.
that sort of adversity for a child. And so here you are now 12 and a half years old, roughly,
Yep.
and you were molested by an older boy when you were 5. I mean, your dad tried to kill your mom. And the way my brain works too is it's very weird because after telling your story, I'm completely focused on you. I'm focused on your sisters and how hard that must be. But then I'm trying to also solve the puzzle of what happened to your mom. And like,
Yeah.
was there head trauma when she got stabbed behind the ear? Like, there's so much, right? But then the environment at Mondo's house, that's like right from the grooming book. Like
Hmm.
he was grooming you,
Hmm.
creating this space that you'd want to come to, always giving you a rule-free house, your freedom, treats, games, all of the things that you could possibly want and desire so that he could get what he wanted and desired. And this went on for 2.5 years, and you were with your mother during the week and him on the weekends. And like, I'm trying to think, like, as a child, you must have always been just trying to convince yourself that this is going to be a better weekend. Maybe this won't happen, or this is going to be a better week. This might, like, to be in survival for that long. And then you say that you were a child, roughly 10 years old, and you were suicidal,
Hmm.
like thinking about death. That's such a. I have way more questions, but I'll let you get through some of the story. 'Cause some of it won't probably come up, but I'm like, like, have you ever spoken to your mom about this? Have you spoken to your sisters about this? Like, that might be a part of your story, and you want to continue, but like these are things that are in my mind. So
Yeah, I mean, those are good questions. I have not really addressed any of this with my family the way that I am here. They all know what happened to me, but they don't. I've never sat down and like had a heart to heart with them about any of this stuff. I don't have a relationship with any of them anymore because of everything that happened, unfortunately. So yeah, I mean, I guess just to kind of wrap up the childhood real quick. Yeah, so I moved with my grandparents. They asked to adopt me. I say yes, and but I still wanted to go to Mondo's house. Like you're in this trap, this like psychological war, and he just guilt trips you over and over and over again. And so at this point, I just hated going to his house. I did not like it. I knew I was going to play video games, but I'd play video games for an hour or two, and then he would molest me for several hours every night, Friday night, Saturday night. I remember laying in his bed for just hours on hours. And, over the course of almost 3 years at this point, it had gone from touching to me touching him to oral sex to reciprocation of that, and him with his fingers, using his fingers on me, and basically every sexual act you can have with somebody, this man was doing to me at 10, 11, 12 years old. And when I was 13 years old, around that time that I had just turned 13, that was the first time that he raped me. And then I could tell you all about that night. That's a whole freaking another story. But I just remember being there, and I remember all the details of it. And the worst part of that was sitting on his toilet afterwards. I remember going to the bathroom and I'm sitting there naked on his toilet crying, and I'm not like in pain, but I'm just destroyed. I just want to die, and I'm getting everything else out of my body, and I'm just wondering why. Like, why me? Like, why is all this happening to me? Why did this have to happen to me? Why did my mom have to do this? Why did my sisters leave, then go back to her? Why have I been getting molested and now raped by this man? I was thinking to myself, like, do I have HIV? Do I have AIDS? You know, I can't say anything to anybody now because everybody's going to think I'm gay, or they're going to think there's something wrong with me, or they're going to think that I've been sleeping with this old man. And you know, they're going to have all of these like horrible things to say about me. So I can't tell anybody now. Like, my life is over, and I'm never going to be married. I'm never going to have a wife or kids or nothing. So I was like, yeah, I mean, I got to kill myself, you know. And so um I don't really know how I survived. I just kind of kept chugging, and I walked out of the bathroom with a smile on and just kind of kept playing the game. And that went on for another 2.5 years. And about a month away from being 16, I was up at his house with a younger friend of mine. And this younger friend was getting groomed. I could see it happening. I could see the comments the guy was making and the gestures he was doing. And it was the same exact things he had done to me. And I picked up on it. And I basically was like, this is it. Like, I'm not going to let this happen to my friend. So I messaged my friend Jacob on this video game. I said, hey, I need you to come over tomorrow after Mondo drops me off. Mondo drops me off the next day, Sunday, and Jacob comes over. And I'm walking back and forth in my room, and I'm telling him, like, hey, I got to tell you something, but I just can't get this, you know, I can't get the words to come out of my body. It's just, I can't say anything. And Jacob looks at me and he says, Mondo touched you, didn't he? And I just fall apart. I fall to the floor crying. And I just can't control myself. I'm slapping the floor. I'm just in a rage, you know. And because this has been going on for 5.5, almost 6 years at this point, and every single weekend, so 300 to 400 occasions of like sexual abuse and molestation. And I'm crying and broken down, and I obviously it's a yes. And so I kind of turn and look at him, and the next thing he says is, he did it to me too. And I could not believe it. Like, my heart was just ripped in half because he was my older friend who was like a hero to me, you know? And I couldn't believe it. Like, he had been molested too by the same guy. And so he's like, well, what do you want to do about it? And I said, we got to go and report him. So we go out, we tell my grandparents, we call 911, we go down to the hospital, and this whole thing was real crazy because I was raped and molested that weekend. And even while my friend was up at the guy's house with me, I was raped and molested that weekend. So we get to the hospital and we're talking to the nurses, and I have to go tell the cop all these horrific details of everything that's happened to me, because the more egregious the crime is, the more they'll really pursue this thing and like hammer the guy. So I'm telling them all these like disgusting details. And we get done with all that, and the nurses are like, oh, well, hey, do you have any clothes, or do you have anything at home that you've worn to his house recently? Like, when was the last time this happened? And I said, well, this just happened 12 hours ago, 15 hours ago, and I have not changed my clothes, and I have not taken a shower, because I knew that I needed to keep all that stuff on me. And the whole room like went silent. And that's the only reason I remember this whole details, because everybody like took a step back. I could like hear people's mouths open up because they're just like, what? And they could not believe that this 15-year-old kid knew to, you know, not take a shower and not take off his clothes and all that. So they test me, they find his DNA, they go and arrest him. And, you know, about a month later, I get a phone call, or my grandparents get a phone call, and he pleads guilty in court. He got 10 years. He got 10 years in prison for molesting 2 boys for about 10 years. And there was just 2 boys that we know of. You know, there may have been more before me and Jacob. So that's kind of crazy, because he'd be free today. He was arrested in 2011. He would be free today, but fortunately enough, he died in 2019. And what's even more scary is that he ran a haunted house in that hometown. So he ran a haunted house that all these little kids would come through, and he'd always be at the end handing them all candy. And if he would have gotten out of prison, like, he would have gone back to doing whatever he was doing before. He would have continued his cycle. I think so, anyways.
He would have. He would have tried for sure, but he would have been on the registered sex offenders list. Like,
right.
You know what I mean? Were you ever angry at Jacob?
No. Nope. Never. I have a keen sense of awareness, I would say. Oddly enough, that I was so naive to fall into that trap. I was also very aware of what was happening to me. I knew that it was wrong. I knew that there was nothing wrong with me for it, but I knew that other people would think that I was wrong and think that I was, disgusting and all these other things. So to that point with Jacob, I knew what the guy had done to me. So I can only imagine what he did to Jacob. It's the same thing, it's the same psychological war that he had gotten over on Jacob. And he's a 30-year-old man with a 15-year-old boy, a 10-year-old boy. He's going to win. He knows how to play the game.
And I think that that's something that people really need to understand too, is the psychology of it and how people can be groomed and how people can say things that like trap you,
Yeah.
right? And then, you made the comment of when you were sitting on the toilet and you were thinking about that and thinking about how people would view you and how your life was over and you were never going to get married. You're never going to have kids. Like, you were 13 and a half years old. Like, geez, right? Like, you know what I mean? Like, that's a heavy cross to bear for someone who's my age, 42, for someone who's older, for a child. And when it came out and he got arrested, you went and you were still living with your grandparents.
That's right.
So there was some stability there from your grandparents, like your safe space, I guess. What happened next? How did you move on from that?
Yeah, the initial impact was like, okay, I don't have any plans this weekend, so I guess I'll just stay at home, because I had moved in with my grandparents, and so I was at a new school, new country school with a bunch of kids I didn't know, so I didn't really have any friends. So that was like really the biggest thing. I was like, man, I don't know what the hell I'm going to do now. Like, I'm bored on the weekends. So fortunately, I mean, school started up soon, because that was in like June or July when I reported him, and I remember going to the fairground that week or that summer in August, and I just got my braces off. My birthday was in August, and so I remember just going to the fairgrounds and walking around, and some girls that I had seen from the school saw me, and I smiled, and they were like, "Oh my God, you got your braces off!" And then, like, I don't know, I just had this like restored sense of confidence, and I just felt good. So I started walking around talking to everybody, and I quickly went from being this like real hated kid to being quite popular, and everybody really liked me. I was funny and charismatic and confident, and I was hiding a lot of things. I was hiding a lot of pain, but I was good at it. Nobody had any clue. I get messages today from people that I went to school with that are just like, holy shit, like, we had no idea, But yeah, I just kind of moved on. I never got any therapy. I never talked to anybody, and I don't say that proudly. I think anybody who goes through it, they absolutely need to go to therapy, and I wish I would have done it, because the impacts, what'll happen when you go through something like this is it may not hit you right away, but it will hit you eventually. It'll either get you in a year, 5 years, 10 years, 15 years. For me, it was about 10 years down the road, it hit me as hard as it ever did. I mean, it affected me while I was going through it, and it affected a lot of my behaviors afterwards with girls and being sexually motivated and things like that. And it affected my personality with people, where I had this victim mentality, this chip on my shoulder. It affected a lot of those things. But, about 10 years later is when it really, really almost took over my life, So I just kind of moved on. Yeah.
It's interesting because before we're going to go to break, but before I go to break, I just have to say, like, trauma like that rewires your brain, and being in survival mode for so long, like, you learn to suppress things. You learn to keep them quiet so that you can move through life. So what you're saying about post makes sense to me, right? It makes sense to me because this is a trauma response and this is how you're behaving. We're going to go to break. We'll be right back.
Life in Stitches by C.K. Sims. Available for purchase in paperback and ebook on all major platforms. Partner today with C.K. Sims and Pod in My Noggin to get in front of an audience that cares. You will be supporting mental health stories, tales of resilience, and uplifting content, aligning your brand with bringing goodness, authenticity, and kindness front and center. This spot could be yours. Do you have a story of struggle and resilience? One that you want to share with others and possibly help someone through their own struggles? Find the link in the show description and fill out the guest form today.
Welcome back, everybody, to Pod My Noggin. We are chatting with Seth Gale this week, and before the break, Seth was sharing his, I'm going to use the word tragic, man, tragic upbringing. Up until about 16 years old, you went through hell. Like, I don't know how else I would explain it, right? I can't comprehend what that must have been like for you. And I don't know why, but I just want to say I'm sorry. I don't know, I don't know why I want to say I'm sorry, but like, I don't believe any child should have to experience what you experienced. Thanks for sticking around. But we talked about afterwards, and this was around 16. It affected your behavior with girls, sexually motivated, that sort of thing. But then, did you finish high school?
Yeah. I mean, I was a straight A student the whole time this thing was going on. So like, I was a perfect student. Actually, the only year of my my educational career that I didn't get perfect grades was my senior year, and that was due to a lot of reasons. I was there's a whole lot of backstory to this that I don't really have time to explain, but I was living at this point. My grandparents had moved to Florida, and I lived in Florida for a brief moment with them, but I had to go back to Ohio because I joined the Army Reserves when I was 17 in high school. And so I went to basic training between my junior and senior year, went to Florida after basic, and the Army was going to kick me out if I didn't go back to Ohio. So kind of made some mistakes. So I went back to Ohio. I was living with a girl and her parents who took me in, and those people are very much like my mom and dad now. But I was living with them, and I found out that my mom had moved to like Texas, my dad moved to Colorado, and just a whole bunch of family drama. One of my cousins was murdered, and this all happened like boom, boom, boom. And so I was a senior in high school living with some random people who didn't really know me, didn't understand me, didn't have any idea what I had been through. And I just had this like horrible mentality. And so I was really struggling, but that was the reason my grades dropped. I just stopped paying attention at school. I got perfect grades the first semester, so I knew that I didn't need to do anything the second, and I literally just showed up, went to sleep, didn't do anything. I almost got straight Fs the second semester. Graduated high school. I remember walking across the stage, nobody clapped for me. I had lost all my friends, sat by myself. I pushed everybody away because I wanted to die, and I didn't want anybody to know what I had been through, but I wanted them to all know that I was struggling, and because they were also happy. Like all the kids I went to school with had mom and dad and families. I mean, I went to this country school where it was very affluent compared to what I had grown up to, So, I mean, just to have a mom and a dad, that you were already considered, like I would consider that as a rich kid. You could be a very middle class family, but if you had mom and dad, you had enough food, you had enough money in your house to have food in your pantry. Like to me, that meant you had money. So I just I had this real hatred towards everybody my senior year. But I graduated, and I went off to the Army, and I joined. I went off, came back, went to college for about a year, and I was almost homeless because I just had no financial literacy. I wasn't taking care of my money, wasn't doing anything right. So then that's when I went active duty, and I joined active duty Army about a year and a half after high school.
And you served overseas?
Well, my first duty station was Fort Stewart, Georgia, and then I went to Fort Bragg, North Carolina. So between those two, I served for 6 years on active. And yeah, I mean, I went all over the place. I went all over the country: Hawaii, Germany, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, Africa, Afghanistan, Dominican Republic. Yeah, I've been all around the world from the Army.
Okay. But so that solved your housing crisis,
Right.
right?
Yeah. Yeah. Joining the Army gave me that stability of a place to live, a place to work. So I had money, a place to live, and food. I had my basic needs when I joined the Army, and it gave me that brotherhood, the community that I needed.
And from a psychological perspective, the structure,
Yeah, exactly. Yep.
right? The accountability, the structure probably were very good for helping you keep it together. So you served how long in the Army in total?
In total, like 8 years, 9 years. I was active for 6 of those.
And so we're at, I'm trying to do the math. So 17, 10, 27, 26 years old. You're 26 years old and you're finishing up with the Army. Like, I'm assuming it's what, 2 terms?
Yeah. It was 1.5, 2. Yeah, something like that.
And then what was next for you?
Well, when I was getting out of the Army, like I was kind of saying earlier, that's when everything kind of crept up on me. The last 6 months getting out of the Army, I mean, I'd always had suicidal ideations pretty much every day, even after being married, having a daughter. My son was born at this point.
Oh, so you met a woman in the Army, got married, had a child.
Mm-hmm.
Okay,
Mm-hmm.
all right.
Yeah. So I mean, I met my wife back in 2000. I don't even remember now. We've been married for 7 years. That's all I know.
She doesn't need to watch this podcast, right?
Yeah, I can't remember what year we met, but we've been married for 7 years, and so we got married. We met and got married quick, and then about a year and a half later, we had our daughter. About a year and a half after that, I went to Afghanistan, or not even that. A year after my daughter was born, I went to Afghanistan. Came back. My son was born after I got back, and that's when I was getting out of the Army. I was about 6 months away from getting out of the Army when I got back from Afghanistan, and for some reason, like something just hit me, and I was going through some. Well, actually, I know why. It was all the stress of the Army plus getting out of the Army. I knew we were going to come back to Atlanta because this is where my wife is from. So we were moving back to Atlanta. I had to get a new job, a new career, find a place to live. I had to do all of these things to support my family. So a lot of that stress was really hitting me hard. And it kind of brought back all my childhood, like trauma and PTSD and stress and anger. And I shut down completely. And it got very dark and really wanted to end it all. And I just kind of hung on. I mean, I had my son and my daughter and my wife to take care of, and they've kind of gotten me through it all. They're the reasons why I stuck around. And so I get out of the Army, came back to Atlanta, started working in construction. And, within a year of working at the third largest home builder in America, I was the number one construction manager in the company. I was the construction manager of the year. I got to go out to Las Vegas and receive a national recognition from the National Association of Home Builders. I got their highest honor award. And so within a year and a half of being out of the Army, I had gotten all these awards, these accolades, all this recognition, made a shit ton of money. And so I was just like, that's when I realized, like, okay, there is a place for somebody like me in this world. Because when I got out, I walked into corporate America and everybody's got suit and ties on and they're nice and clean and they're happy. And for me, happiness, I had not really found out what that was at this point. Like when people talk about happiness, I don't know what that means. And so because of all of these things, that's when I decided, okay, I have to start telling my story or at least write a book or something because, a lot of people go through what I went through, and to be where I'm at, it's impressive. But if you know my backstory, you wouldn't believe it. Like when I was on the stage in Las Vegas and I was receiving this award, I get to go up there and give a speech, and I kind of say thank you to all these different people. But had they known half of what I've been through, I mean, they would have fallen apart in that room, So to see me where I was at, so then about 6 months ago, I started listening to a bunch of podcasts, and I started hearing how impactful other people's stories were to me and how much they helped me heal, even though they have nothing to do with me. We have completely different stories, but their story is very relatable in terms of their trauma, the way they feel, and the way they've recovered from it. And because of that, I decided to start telling my story. So I've been telling my story now for about 6 months, and I've done a few public speaking engagements now. I've got a few more booked for this year to just go out and share my story and explain to people how I overcame all of the trauma and the tragedy that I went through as a young man. And if you're going through it, that there is another side of life that you can discover.
So the thing is, I'm curious here. So like, you say you came through it. You say you had no therapy, right? Which I appreciate the call out, because that's an important call out when it comes to people should definitely get therapy to help. But what do you think actually was the catalyst to turn things around?
Well,
like, was there a moment? Was there a thought?
Yeah, there's a couple of them. So my life has kind of turned around in phases, I would say. You know, when I joined the Army, I would say probably that was my first phase. When I joined active duty, that was my first, like, okay, I'm fixing my life now, because I wasn't going to be poor anymore. I was going to have food and money and, a job, basically. So that was maybe my first phase, but that was like a real small change for me. The next one was right before my daughter was about to be born. I was $60,000 in debt, and we were living paycheck to paycheck, and I had a huge victim mentality. So I read a few books, and I completely flipped my mindset. Now, I changed my mind about everything in life except for one thing, and that was my marriage. So I addressed all the problems in my life. I stopped being a victim about everything. I fixed everything. I started to grow and do better in every aspect of my life except for my marriage. Me and my wife were married for almost 2 years at this point, and our marriage wasn't terrible. I mean, we were still doing pretty good, and our marriage never was terrible throughout the 7 years we were married, but it just wasn't a happy marriage for a long time, I would say, or for a lot of the time. Maybe not consistently, but there's a lot of periods of our marriage that have not just been happy at all. So, and that's because of me. So, like I said, right before my daughter was born, I went through another transformation where I kind of got rid of this victim mentality, and I decided to start really pushing myself in every way to be better. I just couldn't do it with my marriage, and to be a better husband and love my wife. Affection was always something that I just could not do for anybody. But then about 6 months ago, I met a guy. His name's George Hayworth, and he has a podcast, and he's a men's coach, basically, like a men's life coach. And I met him, and I was talking to him about some of my problems, and he kind of shot me straight and was like, "Look, dude," he's like, "you can fix all this other bullshit in your life, and you can't go home and like love your wife. You can't go home and tell your wife that you love her. You want to blame everything on her, because just because I told my wife, before me and my wife got married, I told her, I said, well, I'm jacked up, just so you know. So if you marry me, this is what you're getting. You're getting this full package. You have to be ready for it." And he told me straight up, he's like, "That's bullshit, man." He's like, that is so wrong of you to do. And he said, "I understand what you've gone through is incredibly traumatic, but it is not right for you to go through that, to understand it, and then to use that on somebody else, because I was unintentionally manipulating people, not only my wife, but other people around me. I was doing the gaslighting thing that people do, and I wasn't even trying to do it on purpose. I just knew that it worked. I knew that if I told my wife, well, you married me, when I was deployed in Afghanistan, and she would call me or text me, and she was upset. And I'm like, look, you married me. Like, this is your fault. Like, if you didn't want to be a part of this, you didn't have to. And so I had that conversation with him about 6 months ago, and George really helped straighten me out. And ever since then, my life has taken a complete 180. I mean, I am the happiest that I've ever been in my entire life. I have talked about all of my trauma time and time and time again, and it does not bother me a bit for anybody to know anything about me. And I can walk into my kitchen and give my wife a hug and a kiss and love her. I can text her and tell her I love her. I can talk about her on podcasts and tell her I love her. if you go back and look at the first few podcasts I recorded, I'd say I would always tell everybody, I have these two beautiful children, love them to death. I love my children. They're the most important things in the world. And I have a wife, just a wife, So for me to even just be on this podcast and say that I love my wife and that I think she's incredible and that she's beautiful, that doesn't hurt me anymore. But 6 months ago it did. I couldn't say those things, and I don't know why, but that transformation of well, yeah, I do know why. Yeah. But that transformation of just knowing what the obstacle is and admitting like this is the obstacle, and instead of just avoiding it, because for me, fortunately enough for me, is I have 50 things I can pick from. I got all these different things I can address, right? So if I don't address my marriage, like not that big of a deal, because I've got childhood trauma, I've got maybe some military stuff, I've got all these other problems that I can fix, and then I can say, well, I'm working on all these other things, my marriage can wait, so that I always put it off. And that's like one of those things that I could just, that was that obstacle I didn't have to worry about, and now that's the last one, and now I have to fix it, and that really should have been one of the first ones that I fixed, so
Perhaps. But I don't know if we can fix the marriage before we attempt to fix ourselves.
well, I think it would have been a lot. I think it would have been a lot easier if I would have had a better relationship with my wife, because I almost lost her. So that's the reason why I say that for me is because I tried to leave my wife multiple times, and she did not leave me. Like, I literally told her, I don't want to do this anymore. I don't want to be with you. And she didn't leave me. She yelled and screamed at me about how if she walks out of this door, like, that's it, blah, blah, blah. So she didn't leave me. Like, that was the thing. So I wish I would have addressed it earlier, because we could have been happy for, like, ecstatic. We could have been ecstatically married, not just happily married, but like we could have been so happy about each other, and mostly me being happy about her for the last 7 years, instead of, a lot of regret and pain there. So
I do agree with you. I do. It's really hard to focus on relationships when you yourself are broken, right?
yeah.
And I'm happy that your marriage has a happy ending. So it came to that point. What was the gentleman's name that you just said that you talked to?
His name is George Hayworth.
George Hayworth. I
Yeah.
hadn't heard of it, but sounds like a smart guy.
He is incredible. Yeah.
So to me, I think that's what I was looking for, really, was you sometimes just sort of glaze over, even when I watched on your website, what it was that helped you pivot. And that's where credit has to be given, because one, you never went to therapy, right? But you knew that you weren't okay. Two, you chose to read those books, right? Three, you chose to receive that message. And four, you chose to put it into action. So you fixed yourself somehow, from a broken child with a story so dark and so painful. You pulled your own self up and created this life, this happiness that you're experiencing now. And then George helped you see, but in the same things, those four principles still come into play, right? So he helped you see what the obstacle really was in the marriage. But those four principles still apply. It's because you received, you put to action all of those things. Here we are now, where you can talk about your wife, that she's a beautiful wife, that you love her, all of those things. And you are out here doing great work. And I have a question, and I'm cognizant of time, but the first time that you told your story to someone, what was that like?
So I've told I've told it a few times to different people in like weird settings. I remember telling it the first time on a train. I was in Europe. I was on a train going from like France to Italy or something like that, and I was still in high school. This was like the year after it happened to me. After I reported the guy, it was like maybe 9 months later. I was on this train, and it was a school field trip, and I was talking to this lady, and we had like a 5-hour train ride. And so she was kind of like, well, why do you live with your grandparents? And I was like, I got a story for you. So I kind of went through all this stuff, right? But there was no pressure there. It was just me and this old lady. So that was real easy. And I really held back too. I didn't tell her all these like crazy details. But, the first time I told my story in a setting like this, it's actually on my YouTube channel. It's a 3.5-hour video, and it was incredibly painful. I had not rehearsed it. I just sat down and was like, hey man, I got my jiu-jitsu coach and a few other buddies who had cameras, and I said, hey, let's shoot a podcast style interview, and let me just tell my story. I'm tired of holding back. I'm tired of hiding this. And that was very uncomfortable, very painful. And if you watch that video, I'm like grabbing my legs. I'm very fidgety. I'm stuttering over my words. There's a lot of ums and I can't get the words out. It was really hard for me, and I broke down. I cried 3, 4, 5 times in that video. That was really hard the first time I told it.
I'm going to tell everybody at home we need to go watch that video because I'll probably cry. There was a couple points when you were talking that I was like, don't cry on screen. Just keep it together. You said something earlier that I want to call out as well, because you saw a podcast, you heard stories that weren't your story, but they helped you because something in those stories resonated, right? And I think that that's what is so important about our lives and humanity, is that when we share the shit that we've gone through and how we've survived, I don't even want to say succeed for everybody, because not everybody succeeds in the way they want to, but just survive can help others heal and move through it and get inspired, or like yourself, want to start talking about it. And just talking about it is a healing process, right? Everyone at home, you can check Seth out at his website at SethGale.com. I'm going to link it in the description, but if you're listening, it's Seth, S-E-T-H, Gale, Gehle.com. I feel like it's spelled Irish. Is it Irish?
I think it's German. I don't know.
Okay, but so .com. He's also on Instagram and YouTube as Go Beyond the Shadows. That's where you're going to find that 3.5-hour tearjerker of an interview that he did. You're out public speaking. You've got gigs coming up this year still, and you have an estimated release of your memoir for the end of the year.
Yeah, we're looking at like September, October right now, I think. I should have a marketing graphics here soon, here in probably 4 weeks maybe.
And do we have a working title?
Yeah, the title will be Strength Beyond the Shadows.
Strength Beyond the Shadows. I got to write this down. So look for this when you are in the fall.
Yeah.
Strength Beyond the Shadows. And I'm sure you can get updates on his social media and SethGale.com. Seth, you're right. It does help to talk about it. And I think without you even knowing the capacity or the reach, really, people will listen to your interviews that you give and the talks that you give, and it will impact them. For me, it just calls full front and center how much we really have to speak up, even when we're kids, when we're young adults. If we see things that are happening that even cause question, we need to address them, right? I don't know who was in your life that could have maybe have possibly seen or even been hinted at that you were going through something, but this is why we need to speak up. Thank you so much for coming on the show. I really appreciate your time. I wish you the very best. And I look forward to reading your book.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate you having me on, and I will push out some information soon on how people can be updated and receive updates when the pre-sales and the book sales come out. So thank you.
Thank you. For everyone else, I'll see you next time.
For media and sponsorship inquiries, email info@cksims.com or visit cksims.com and fill out the contact form. Be sure to subscribe so you don't miss an episode. A new episode airs every Saturday. CKS Media.